Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Achieving Cultural Competence. We appreciate you taking time to attend this session. Our webinar is brought to you by the Kaleidoscope Group. My name is Barbara Sanner. I'll be your moderator today. Our goal is to make this an interactive webinar, so we encourage you to participate throughout and submit questions as you think of them. To ask a question, simply type into the questions box of your GoToWebinar control panel where it says enter a question for staff and click send. We'll ask your questions to the presenters toward the end of today's session. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can, but if we don't get to yours, we'll follow up with you via email. Also, please take a few minutes to complete the survey at the end of the webinar. It should take less than 3 minutes to complete, and your feedback is very important to us. Now I'd like to introduce Melanie Munoz, consultant for the Kaleidoscope Group, who will be fielding questions today and asking them to our presenters, Jackie Baldiga and Kelly McMiller. Now I'll turn it over to Jackie to get us started.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on achieving cultural competence and ultimately impacting organization success. I want to just say you are in the right place on this webinar if you are feeling any of these things listed here. You might be joining us today because you're anxious to make D&I an everyday reality in your organization. Or you might be struggling to get everyone playing an active role. Perhaps in your organization there's a few key people or a few key groups who are doing a lot in this space, but you're really looking to get everyone contributing to achieving D&I success. You might also be feeling frustrated at times that people think it's not their job. Again, you know, this is related to the previous point. You know, we got to get everyone playing a role. It's everyone's job. You might also be feeling like you're the only one who sees biases at play. I know there's been a lot of conversation as of late around conscious and unconscious bias. It's gotten on the radar screen of many people really talking about it and starting to hone in on it and identify it. And you might also be unsure about what is this cultural competence thing, and why do organizations need it? Some of you might be thinking, I'm not really sure about all that. I'd like to learn more. Lastly, I'd say you're in the right place if you're wondering how to move from D&I activity to achieving true inclusion. True inclusion. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So just to share a little bit about myself and Kelly, your facilitators here on the call today. Again, I'm Jackie Baldiga. I'm a Senior Vice President with Kaleidoscope. I've been working with Kaleidoscope for about 15 years on the consulting side of our business. And my primary role is leading engagements and partnering with clients in this work toward achieving true inclusion. I consider myself a practical strategist in this space of cultural competence, education, and development, and I'm looking forward to this conversation here today on the topic. Kelly?
Thanks, Jackie. So I'm Kelly McMiller, and due to unforeseen circumstances, my colleague Gary Alvarenga could not join us today, but I'm extremely excited and happy to be here to share my experience around cultural competence. I've been with the Kaleidoscope Group for 5 years, but was a client for a decade prior, leading diversity and inclusion at Sara Lee Corporation and also at a communications company prior. So it's really interesting to see things from both sides, being in your seat or having been in your seat at one point, and then now also working with a multitude of clients and the challenges that they might face in really achieving cultural competence successfully. So just a little bit about who the Kaleidoscope Group is. The Kaleidoscope Group is a full-service diversity and inclusion consulting firm. We are headquartered here in Chicago, and we're really known for a holistic and integrated approach around partnering with our clients to meet their unique needs. We're currently led by our CEO, Doug Harris. You may have heard of him. He's a nationally recognized speaker and presenter on this topic. And we also really have assisted organizations in managing culture change for a number of years, over 30 years. And so we're excited to really share with you what we've learned in working with clients from the standpoint of creating and achieving cultural competence. The other thing I'm really excited about as well is we have, being part of Kaleidoscope Group, our vision as a company is to free the human potential. And so it's really interesting when you say, well, how does that really happen? And I think it happens when people are able to really be their authentic self, or be real, if you will. So with that said, for us, it's really about engaging real people in this dialogue, having real conversations about real issues to create real change. And so we'll talk a little bit about that today. So the other thing is that when we work with clients, we like to say, we know diversity and inclusion, and you know your culture. So just a quick list of who our partial client list, and we're proud to say we have a diverse group of clients as well. So it goes from companies that are maybe local or have a global presence, a wide variety of industries, both profit, nonprofit, also even in academia or corporate roles. But either way, we work with our clients to build strong relationships and provide that thought leadership as credible advisors in this space.
All right, so just to tell you a little bit about the purpose of the webinar today, we're going to be spending our time together really examining and understanding the critical role of cultural competence in achieving what we call true inclusion. And we're also going to be talking about, how do you develop it? How do you develop cultural competence? What is it, and how do you develop it? So what you're going to learn today is the power of true inclusion, what is cultural competence, and what is that road to cultural competency. And we talk about that as it relates to importance, insight, inclusion, and integration. So before we kind of dive into the rest of our conversation here, just want to let you know to keep an eye out at the end of this webinar. We're going to have a special giveaway called the True Inclusion Opportunity, and we'll tell you a little bit more about that later on in this session. So let's go ahead and get started. The power of true inclusion. Kelly?
All right. So the power of true inclusion is, really one when everyone can bring all that they embody to the workplace. And so when we started this work, we started doing diversity and inclusion over 30 years ago. Back then, 90% of potential clients had done nothing in this space. Today, about 90% of most major corporations have done something. So the big question is, have we truly achieved an inclusive work environment? So studies will show that we haven't. So what does that really take? Okay, so true inclusion requires what we call kind of the 3 C's. So commitment, course, and competence. So true inclusion requires commitment from the organization, but it also requires a course of action. So that's like the ability to really execute in a culturally competent way. It also, I think, is a must-have is we have to have ownership, so organizational and individual ownership. But that's not enough. Companies also have to be committed to true inclusion, and that doesn't happen unless individuals have that cultural competence. So we've all heard the phrase, right, that people don't quit companies, they quit managers. Well, people quit managers when they don't feel valued, when individuals don't feel like their opinions matter, when they don't feel like their talents are being fully utilized. And so that's what today is all about. How do we achieve cultural competence? So cultural competence is really the key to employees feeling valued. And in this study that was conducted by Catalyst, it highlights how much feeling included really contributes to innovation, contributes to discretionary effort, and even a sense of belonging. So essentially, belonging and feeling like you matter for what you uniquely bring to the table really equals inclusion in most countries. So if you want to really build a high-performing team that delivers innovation, make them feel like they're included at work. And so I'll turn it over to Jackie to say, well, that helps us understand what is the clear pathway to get to cultural competency and valuing all of our employees.
All right, so on this opportunity just ahead as it relates to cultural competence and true inclusion, I want to start by just talking a little bit about, what does it mean to be culturally competent? And this is Kaleidoscope's definition. We say it's how you think, believe, and demonstrate inclusive behaviors in all situations. All situations. So it's, you know, it's a lofty goal, if you will. And just to share a little bit more about what that journey looks like, you know, you got to start with this in this think stage, really expanding our thoughts, right? Very simply expanding our thoughts. And we sometimes joke and say the easiest way to do that is to hang around different kinds of people, right? If I hang around people who are just like me, we're going to be pretty limited in our thinking and pretty limited in our view of the world. So that's kind of the first part. The second part is to challenge our beliefs, and that really involves assessing and challenging biases. We like to say we're all good people and we all have biases. Mine might be different than Kelly's, they might be different than yours, but we all have them. Doesn't make us bad people, but we have to do that personal work to really identify what they are and perhaps to challenge and change them. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't have opinions, right? Sometimes people think diversity and inclusion is about going totally neutral. Don't have an opinion, don't say anything, just be neutral. And that's not it at all. We all have opinions and we want to hear those opinions, but we have to realize our opinions can sometimes be wrapped up in bias. And so how do we manage that? And that kind of leads us into this demonstrate, which is about adapting, modifying, or changing behavior. Doesn't mean you got to change who you are, but cultural competence is about, are we flexible? Are we able to adjust and show up in culturally appropriate ways, if you will, in effective ways? I should say culturally effective ways. And that means we might have to modify the way we approach someone or a situation depending on what's needed in that particular scenario. So that's kind of what we mean by cultural competence, to think, believe, and demonstrate. How do you go about developing that? Our approach is what we call the 4 I's. And those stand for importance, insight, inclusion, and integration. And so there's an education journey, right, associated with the 4 I's. Education and development needs to take place around each of these components. And importance is really about, when we think about it from a learning outcome, it's really about establishing a clear understanding of the business impact of D&I, not just in your organization, but in your area. Everyone understanding what's the business impact in my particular area at the company that I'm a part of. Insight is that personal awareness space, really tuning into what's my cultural background, how do I see the world, why do I see it the way that I do? I've been influenced by all kinds of things growing up, things I've been taught, things I've seen in the media, and how does that impact, you know, how I show up in the workplace and how I show up with other people? Which takes us into inclusion. Inclusion is now kind of the skill component. How do I skillfully interact, relate to, and work with people, work with everyone in an inclusive manner? And then lastly, integration. The learning outcome here is around maximizing the performance, not just of myself, but of others and ultimately the organization. So these are really the kind of the 5 phases or, you know, focus areas, if you will, in terms of learning when it comes to cultural competence. All of this grounded in achieving better business outcomes. Some of those listed here, and Kelly's going to talk about those in a little bit more detail as we continue on here in this conversation. Kelly?
Oh, all right. So with importance, just to dig in here a little deeper, it's really about the business value. So we've worked with a ton of clients, and one of the things that has been a key learning is when organizations try to jump straight into education around diversity and inclusion, but they haven't really defined the importance of it for their business. So importance is that clear understanding of the business impact of D&I in the organization. And then I would also add specifically within your area. So I'm actually able to make the connection point regardless of what function or department or business area that I'm in. So when we look at what is that bottom line impact, more specifically, cultural competence impacts a variety of areas in the organization. So for example, when we operate in a culturally competent way, it makes each individual relationship more productive, and that leads to quality solutions. When we are culturally competent on teams, our teams are more effective, and the outcome is often innovation and collaboration. And with people managers, they're better able to empower their people, leading to enhanced performance. And so when we implement our people processes, and sometimes obviously that's owned by certain areas, so HR, or if you're a hiring manager, hiring and promotions might fall into this category. But doing that in a culturally competent way will create fairness and equity for everyone. And it really helps us to even retain the workforce, but not just the workforce, but I would say a committed workforce, as Jackie just mentioned, in the business outcomes. So our culturally competent client service really creates satisfied customers and expands our businesses into new and emerging markets. And then lastly, when we are culturally competent, all of our external relationships, it really creates a positive reputation for the organization, helps us to become that employer of choice. And the reality is that any of these areas can impact another. So if you have a positive reputation, it can help you when it comes to really hiring a retained, committed workforce, if you will. So one can really impact the others. So the next thing I want to share with you is, some information around this debate, if you will, around homogeneous teams versus diverse teams. And so when we look at this from that team performance perspective, homogeneous teams, when they get together because there is a connection, they often will perform really well, but then they taper off. But when it comes to diverse teams, it takes them a while to get started. And so their trajectory is often that they start pretty slow, but then they take off to a higher performance perspective because they're really leveraging each other's differences. And there's more power, if you will. Now, the interesting part is when companies start to approach this diversity and inclusion effort, they'll get a diverse team together, and diverse teams often will quit. And right where you see that X is they'll kind of taper off and say, okay, we're done, this didn't work. But the reality is if you stick with it, it can really go to that next level.
Yeah, Kelly, just to kind of add to that as well, that X that you see here on the slide, the way you kind of get over that X and get to that higher level performance is through cultural competence. That's what it takes. Sometimes, so there is an element of, you got to hang in there, and it sometimes takes a little bit longer to get there, but you also got to have the skills, those cultural competence skills, which we're talking about here today. And I also wanted to just share a quick story. We were, a real life example of how this kind of showed up in one of our client organizations. We were working with a manufacturing client, and they were looking for cost savings on the shop floor. So they put together, a team. Everyone on the team was pretty much management level or higher, and got some great diversity within that team. They had, they had the engineers, they had the supervisors, they had, people of different ages, so on and so forth. And they did a pretty good job, like this, a little bit more homogeneous team, even though they had some diversity. But when they started really thinking about how could we be even more diverse, what are we missing on our team, they decided to expand their membership and to include members from the shop floor, from all the different areas on the shop floor, who were actually out there kind of running the machines and doing the work. And what they found with that new, more diversified team, they came up with an additional $1 million of the first year that the team was together. So homogeneous teams can produce great work. Diverse teams, produce even, more exceptional work. So just a quick little example there on this whole concept of diverse teams.
I just want to say, I think you may have cut out there, so that was $1 million in savings through the efforts of this diverse team looking at the same situation? Okay.
Yep, $1 million in the first year, simply from, diversifying the team and bringing in more perspectives. And the big element that was missing was that, they were looking at managers and above, but we're missing that kind of day-to-day, the people out there, doing the work.
Got it.
So let's talk about the second I, insight. And this is about really expanding your personal understanding of your own cultural background, your worldview, and its impact in the workplace. And when it comes to, personal insight, we have what we call our 5 conscious inclusion principles. Conscious inclusion principles. And I'm going to share a little bit about what we mean by each one of these. The first one is around demonstrating empathy. When it comes to creating true inclusion, This is crucial. We've got to really be able to walk in someone else's shoes and really understand who they are, where they're coming from, and genuinely care. And when we're open and honest with one another, that actually builds trust, and that builds stronger relationships. So this is what we're kind of getting at from, a belief perspective in terms of, what set that we need to be able to adopt in order to create this true inclusion that we're talking about. Embracing differences, that's the third one here. And this isn't just about tolerating or accepting. I know we sometimes hear those words, but it's really embracing differences, seeking it out, missing it when it's not there, and really engaging in that dialogue to hear the different perspectives. The next one here is about managing privilege. I know many of you have probably heard a lot on this topic. The way Kaleidoscope thinks about privilege, we believe that we are all privileged. We're all privileged on perhaps different dimensions of diversity, but we're all privileged. And we believe that to have true inclusion, we have to operate out of a privileged mindset. Owning, understanding what our privilege is, and using that to create fairness for others. If everyone used their privilege to create fairness for others, we would get to this place of true inclusion that we're talking about. And then the last one here is to act courageously. Act courageously. I love a quote from Mahatma Gandhi: "You must be the change you wish to see in the world." And it's so true when it comes to true inclusion. Sometimes we want to, step aside and wait for someone else to act first. I don't want to be the first one. But to really make progress in this space, we've all got to act courageously, take the risk, take a stand when a stand is needed, and say what needs to be said and do what needs to be done. So these are the 5 conscious inclusion principles that we design a lot of our education and development around.
Yep. So as we kind of talk through that skill side of, how do we get at this real conversation? So the way to do that is really kind of in this next I. So many times people will go through awareness workshops, or they feel that they're already aware. And so I've got the aha moment, but now what do I do? Where are the skills to really get there? So inclusion is the skill side, and that's your ability to skillfully interact and relate and work with everyone in an inclusive manner. So regardless of the difference, I can adapt and adjust and even listen in terms of learning what's needed to be skillful in this situation. So one of the conscious inclusion principles Jackie mentioned was communicate authentically, and ironically, you all rated that pretty high. So let's talk about what's involved in communicating authentically as we talk about skills. So in order to really do this well, it's about having real conversation. And so what's involved in real conversation is the environment, courage, competence, and value. So first, before we can even exercise the skill of being culturally competent, leaders must set the proper environment. The other thing you have to have is individuals must have the courage to share, as we've just discussed. And then participants, who's ever involved in the conversation, must have that dialogue skillfully. And organizations have to see the value in the first place of having the discussion. I think we've all worked in environments where, even if your boss, if you will, or someone you're engaging in conversation may be direct or open or authentic, but overall, from an organizational culture, it's not valued. So a culture can almost warrant, or I don't want to say demand, but create an environment where people are, having sidebar conversations around you and not with you. So let's talk about what are those skills that everyone needs to embody, or competencies that are needed at each level in the organization. So the first group is the individual contributors. And so for individual contributors, they really need to participate at the end of the day in an inclusive environment and manage whatever relationships they have across lines of difference, and then obviously behave inclusively. And so for the next level, which we'll call our people leaders or managers, they'll have to do that as an individual and build a diverse team. And then not just having the diversity at the table, but how do we leverage the differences once they're at the table and then lead in an inclusive way. And for our next level, we're really looking at senior leaders to expand what we call the profile of success. And so this is an interesting phrase. So let me clarify. So many organizations have a profile of success. That would be who is successful here. What are the things that make people successful? Or who do you typically hire? What are those traits, if you will? And so in order to really make sure we're not missing out on anything, there might be an opportunity in an organization to expand that profile in order to include diversity, if you will. Next, senior leaders also have to develop inclusive leaders because they're obviously leaders of leaders. And then it's important that senior leaders communicate the diversity and inclusion message, and that ability to articulate it in a personal way is also important. And then finally, as we look at the top of the house, again, they too need to embody all of these competencies, but as executives, they're really looked at to define what is the business value for D&I for our organization, and of course establish the accountabilities, and then walk the talk. So demonstrating that commitment, and I think that's very important, not just that demonstration the way I see it as an executive, but how do individual contributors, what do they need to see to know I get it? And so all of these are the competencies that are really needed to create inclusion. So I'll turn it over to Jackie to finish out our fourth I on integration.
All right, thanks, Kelly. So integration, the last I of the 4 I's. And as we mentioned earlier, it's about maximizing the performance not only of ourselves, but of others that we work with, others that we lead, and ultimately the organization. And so a way to think, one of the ways that we like to think about integration is really getting specific to the different roles that people play in diversity and inclusion. And so I want to share with you what we call our key stakeholder ownership model. We talked a little bit earlier about, everyone really needing to own diversity and inclusion at the organization, own the success, and play the appropriate role. And the role is different, right? Everybody's not doing the exact same thing, nor do we want them doing the exact same thing. So we put them in 3 categories. We have results, stakeholders, we have strategy and guidance stakeholders, and then we have process owners. So the results stakeholders do just that. They are ultimately accountable for achieving the results of the business strategy and for achieving true inclusion. And that includes all of the groups that are listed here. And they've really got to be managing accountability around true inclusion, instilling commitment throughout the organization, and modeling the behaviors, right? Everyone's watching the leaders. Everyone's watching to see, well, are you doing it and what does it look like? These groups here in the center are what we call the strategy and guidance groups. So groups like your Diversity and Inclusion Council, maybe employee or business resource groups, advocates who are playing a role out in the organization to drive change, just as some examples. But again, their role is simply to provide strategy and guidance. They are not accountable for achieving the results, which sit there on the left side of the chart. So they might be helping the organization establish accountability or define the importance or make recommendations to set the direction. And then lastly, we have process owners. Many of the functional areas, just a few of them listed here, that exist in many organizations. And they have to really take diversity and inclusion and integrate it into what they do functionally. So are we marketing from a multicultural perspective? And what are the cultural competencies that I need in order to do that? From a procurement standpoint, do we have a diverse supplier network? And, how do I go about expanding that network? And then how do I engage in those relationships with diverse suppliers and vendors and contractors and so on? Community relations. Do we have relationships out with a variety of associations and partnerships in the community? And how do we engage with them in a culturally competent way? So in this integration phase of the 4 I's, we're really talking about now bringing it down to the day-to-day functional role, the unique role that each of these groups play within the organization, and providing very specialized cultural competence development to enable them to achieve that role or to meet the expectations of that role. So that's just a little bit about integration. Let's talk about what's next. So, as you showed up on this webinar here today, you showed up maybe for some of these reasons listed here. There might be some other reasons that I haven't mentioned, but, we talked about, being anxious to make D&I an everyday reality. Maybe that struggle to get everyone playing an active role. Maybe a little frustration, that some people think it's not their job, or feeling like you're the only one who sees some of these biases that are playing out in the organization and how they might be negatively impacting teams, relationships, business results, and outcomes. And maybe feeling a little unsure about what is this cultural competence thing and why do organizations need it. So hopefully, we've addressed some of these items in terms of how do you go about, addressing some of these struggles, if you will. And we also learned here today, the power of true inclusion. How does it benefit the bottom line? Kelly spoke to that a little bit earlier. What is cultural competence? That's that think, believe, and demonstrate inclusive behaviors in all situations. And then what's the roadmap to get there? And that was the 4 I's: importance, insight, inclusion, and integration. So, as we start to kind of wrap this up, this true inclusion, what does it really look like, right? And we often articulate it as what we call 1 + 1 = 3. 1 + 1 = 3. And so you can have different levels of performance around true inclusion in organizations depending on what the beliefs are that are at play, what the behaviors are, what kind of culture there is, and that all shows up in terms of business performance. So some organizations might have what we call 1 + 1 = 1. You got 2 people at the table, but I'm sitting here and you're just like me, and so basically we're going to pretty much agree on everything. We're going to have a lot of homogeneous thinking going on, and our performance is probably going to be somewhat inconsistent. We might hit the mark sometimes, but we might miss the mark sometimes because we just don't know what we don't know. In this 1 + 1 = 1.5, we might have a belief that, yeah, I like difference as long as it's, still kind of like me. And so the behavior might be around bringing in different people, but then kind of, expecting them to fit in, if you will. And we would tend to have a culture of assimilation, right? It's kind of the melting pot that we often talk about in this country. Back in the day, as people migrated here, it was, come to America and be American, right? Assimilate, fit in, change your name, speak English, all of that. Let's all be the same. And, in this, if you have an organization of assimilation, performance is probably kind of average. I mean, you're going to get some different kinds of thinking. You might get some additional benefits beyond 1 + 1 = 1, but still be, somewhat average performance. In this 1 + 1 = 2 phase, the belief is, we tolerate differences, right? We'll bring in different kinds of people. I guess we have to. I guess we'll put up with them for now, as long as we don't go too overboard here. And so the behavior might be kind of superficial. I smile and, I'm pleasant and I'm nice, to your face, but who knows what I'm saying behind your back, right? So we tend to have a culture of nice. We sometimes hear clients describe cultures as terminally nice. We're so nice when we interact with one another, but the real talk takes place at the water cooler or in the bathroom. I might be speaking my truth, but I'm not speaking it to you. And so, performance can be good, but it's still not at that level that we're really trying to get to, which is 1 + 1 = 3. Here, the belief in the organization is a desire for difference, really seeking it out. The behavior is going to be healthy dialogue. And if people aren't used to healthy dialogue, they might feel a little uncomfortable. They might be like, I don't know about this. Maybe, maybe we should be a little nicer with one another, but that's not really the case. Healthy dialogue is simply that. It's respectful. It's, people are truly sharing their opinions and ideas. They're listening with one another, and you've got those inclusive, those conscious inclusion principles really being at play, that authentic communication. We're acting courageously. We're embracing those differences, and you're going to have that culture of true inclusion. And this is where organizations really outperform their expectations. They don't know what they're going to get. They know it's going to be good when we have true inclusion and we really desire those differences and have healthy dialogue, and they'll often outperform even what they thought they could do. So, just some food for thought here around, what does it really mean? You can be at different levels in terms of where your organization is at on this kind of true inclusion continuum. Lots of examples of success that we've had with clients, helping them to work towards true inclusion and achieve true inclusion. A number of those listed here. Not going to go through all of these, but want to share a couple of examples of how it looks different in different organizations in terms of what are we trying to really get to. So we were working this global organization. We were working with them, and they had been making some great progress with diversity and inclusion in the U.S., but really they were operating in over 40 countries. And so the question was, how do we now take this across the globe? And how do we do it in 40 different countries? Because they all have their own unique cultures. And they didn't want to approach it in kind of a traditional, let's all run everyone through a workshop kind of way, but really wanted to create that common message and that alignment. And so the way we kind of tackled that scenario was to create what was called a Leadership Diversity and Inclusion Symposium. And it was simply that: bring senior leaders together, create a place where people could really share what's on their mind, ask the questions they've always wanted to ask, even if they thought it might be an unpopular question, and really explore the topic with one another. What does it mean here? How do we get aligned around that? And what's the business value for our organization? And through that process of dialogue and alignment and real conversation, they were able to create this common message across the globe around what does it mean here. Another really interesting one, we were doing some work with a Christian-based organization. And, as they were diversifying their workforce, lots of differences coming into the organization, from people from all walks of life, right? And so, how in a Christian-based organization, one of the questions became, how in a Christian-based organization do we create true inclusion for people who might not be Christian, right? They might be of other faiths, they might be non-believers, but they've got talents and skills and competencies and different ideas and opinions and so on. And so, we want to really accept and embrace those differences and get the best out of everyone, while also, balancing our own personal values, our own personal beliefs in Christianity. And so how do you kind of build that bridge and appreciate those differences, even if we're not all the same, if you will. So those are just a couple of examples of how to kind of tackle this concept of true inclusion and how it can look different in different organizations, and how the approach can really needs to be tailored and customized. So we mentioned at the beginning of the webinar that we had a takeaway for you as a participant. So I want you to watch your inbox. You'll be receiving something in your email, shortly after this webinar. And what we're going to be helping you with is this tool that we call, that's a little bit of a stakeholder assessment, if you will. And it's called the Inclusion Opportunity. So we took a look at some of the stakeholder groups a little bit earlier in this conversation. And what we're providing you with is kind of a little mini assessment tool where you can take a deeper look at each of those stakeholder groups, and you can start to answer some of these questions. Well, what have we already achieved? Because I know many of you are out there doing a lot of great stuff, and you are achieving things. You are having some impact, maybe looking for a little bit more. And if that is, what's still needed? And based on those needs, how might it be addressed, right? So this little tool is going to show up in your inbox. You can take a look, maybe get some deeper insight around what the needs are for your various stakeholders. And what do you do about it? Well, I'm glad you asked. What do you do about it? Here at Kaleidoscope, we've got what we call stakeholder development journeys. So it's a whole development, education and development journey unique to these various stakeholder groups that you have listed here. So, what is it that executives need? And how do we prepare them to play the role that we need them to play as champions for this effort? How about middle managers? How do we help them unlock the potential of everyone on their team? Individual contributors, they play a role as well. How they interact with peers, how they show up on teams, so on and so forth. So we do have unique stakeholder development journeys for each of these groups that we can share more about with you in follow-up conversations. So I'm going to turn it back over to Kelly to review some more specific next steps. Kelly?
All right, so we're going to go into questions in just a moment because I'm really, I'm starting to see those come through, and we want to get to those with the remaining time. So quickly, let me just also share that your next steps really could be to schedule a 30-minute complimentary consultation. So if you have specific questions about your organization, we can address that. So in order to do that, it's really easy. First, right after this webinar, or you can even do that right now, you're going to visit kgdiversity.com/let's talk. That's kgdiversity.com/let's talk. All right, and so what you'll do is you'll go to our website where you'll see a simple form. First, you'll select the date and time you want, and then you fill out the simple form and just click the button to reserve your spot. So let me quickly walk you through what this looks like so you're all clear. So on the calendar, you'll see available dates. The grayish-purple dates are wide open. The orange dates with the little clock means that there's already someone booked at that time, but there's still spots available. So after you choose a date, you'll press the button and to select your time. So when you open the options to select a time, what works best for you, you might see some times are grayed a bit. And so those are times that are already booked or unavailable, but just choose one that works best for you. So then you just fill out this easy form. So if you want to share anything about your current situation, so we'll be prepared to have the kind of dialogue that will be effective, just you do that there in the comments or questions section, and just let us know, and we'll be able to handle that. Then don't forget to hit the button at the bottom that says reserve my spot. That's it. It's that easy. So the person that will be helping you is our very own Melanie Munoz, and we're actually going to turn it over to Melanie as we do the Q&A. Now, one thing before I do that, I'll just say that after you've set your time, you'll have an opportunity to put the date and time of your consultation into your calendar right away. So I recommend you do that, and we look forward to speaking to you one-on-one. Okay, Melanie?
Thank you, Kelly and Jackie. So we have one of the first questions here is explaining by what we mean by everyone has privilege.
Everyone has
Jackie,
privilege. Yeah. Yeah. Everyone has privilege. So the short answer, and we can delve deeper with you one-on-one if you'd like, but the short answer is, when we look at privilege, we look at it across the various dimensions of diversity, and the list can be long. It could be 50 dimensions of diversity. So things like ethnicity, age, gender, language, education level, all of those kinds of things. And in our society, certain people are what we call insiders, more the majority norm or the power base. And some people are the outsiders. So myself, I'm a white female. Being white in U.S. society makes me an insider, right? So I have privilege on that dimension. I'm college educated. I have privilege from an education standpoint. And so it's recognizing where I have privileges and then how do I use those to create equity for others. So that's kind of the short answer. We do a full 8 hours on managing privilege, and I'm trying to give you the 30-second version, so hopefully that helps a little bit. But like I said, would love to have further conversation with you about that.
Perfect. Thank you, Jackie. Our next question is, how do we enlighten or motivate people to let them know that cultural competency is part of their job?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it starts and is connected maybe to another question around why are we doing this, right? What is the business value? And so people at some point have to realize either organizationally and or individually that there's value in doing this, that it will help me do my job better, faster, help me reach more people, help me be more effective in relationships, et cetera. So I think, the motivation comes when people see what's in it for me, right? And many times when you see resistors in some respect, doesn't have to be loud, but outside of, people that aren't on board, it's because they either A, don't see the value, or B, they think they're being left out in some capacity. So the motivation is to let them know this is about you, and it's about everyone doing this well. are looking at it as cultural competence is a muscle that I can develop. I may not be culturally incompetent, but there's opportunities for me to learn. So as I move from one environment to the next, I may be culturally competent around African American females because I am one, or I might think that I am. But as I have conversations with others, I can now work more effectively across different areas or differences, or in different rooms or in different conversations, if you will. Jackie, anything you would want to add to that?
Nope, that sounds great, Kelly. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. So our senior leaders are committed. It's the middle management we can't seem to engage. Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, there's a number of ways to tackle that one, and that's a tough one. Middle managers have a lot coming at them, right? They got stuff coming down, from the top. They've got stuff coming up from their teams. They're juggling a lot. So I think, middle managers are oftentimes, they're the ones we ask everything of in an organization. And sometimes diversity and inclusion can feel like, oh, it's just another ask, how much more can I fit on my plate? And so I think there's several ways we found to really get middle managers engaged. Kelly started to speak to this a little bit. First of all, I think we have to establish that business value, the what's in it for them. How's it going to make their job easier? What's the business value of a diverse team? How is that going to help them, produce better results? I think there's also, team level solutions are needed to get middle managers on board, so really helping them in their team on a regular basis. How do we really create true inclusion? Because again, they want to see the benefit in their day-to-day, something that they can, realize right away. And if we get teams and middle managers operating more culturally competent, in a more culturally competent way, the organization overall is going to benefit. And then I'd say lastly, I think, the message really needs to be tailored, to the middle managers. I mean, we've got to talk to them, find out what's important to them. Let's not assume we know what's important to them, but find out what's important to them. And then we've got to link inclusion to helping them, achieve what it is they're looking to achieve. So that's just a couple of thoughts on how you can get middle managers engaged.
The other thing, too, from an organizational change perspective is at the beginning of a change effort, we always, I think, in our space have an argument. And when I say in our space, I'm thinking learning and development, organizational development, as well as D&I, around the carrot or the stick, right? And so in the beginning, I have seen many clients say, you have to do this, or it's mandatory, or at the initial start to get people on board. But eventually it has to shift to the carrot, so the incentive around it, right? And so I think there is a bit of where are you right now in the organization, and who's sending the message, right? The tailored message, but who's sending it, who's talking about it and reinforcing it, and then are there accountabilities in place, whatever that looks like for your organization at the right stage and time.
Perfect. Thank you, ladies. The next question is, what are some recommended ways for leaders to create a safe environment for a real talk or real conversation?
I'll go first, Kelly, and if and please add too. I think one of the most effective and perhaps easiest way is to be authentic as a leader, right? Communicate in a genuine way. Maybe be a little vulnerable in terms of around sharing who you are, why you see things the way you do, how you got to the place that you did, that kind of thing. So I think model it, show what real conversation looks like. And when you do that, when you really do speak your truth, I think you kind of open the door for others to share their truth as well. And I think when they do share their truth, you've got to be willing to hear it, to engage in the conversation, and to create the opportunity for people to continue to share. We might sometimes say, "Oh yeah, I want to hear the truth. Give it to me," and then someone does, and and we get mad or upset, or there's we dole out some negative consequence, and that's going to shut it down right there. Kelly, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, you really hit it on the head. Vulnerability is a big conversation right now, and has been, I think, for a few years. But if you think about where those relationships really work, meaning between supervisors and maybe someone, individual contributor, it's when people are following that leader when they know that leader is real. So I can't underscore that enough. And to your point, the consequences. So if I did it once, I was real once, I'll never do it again after the way you reacted. So I think it's on point. Yep.
Perfect. And then we had one of the participants ask, will you elaborate a little bit more on the business value and how you can measure cultural competence?
Yeah, I think we might have addressed that. I think the measurement piece, maybe we didn't. So the first part of it is, why maybe the business value, why is that important? And so the way we look at it is, how do we set the tone or the environment for success, whether that's around education or anything else? And when people make that business value connection, then we often see more success. So I'm going to jump out on a limb here to say the measurement of it would be, do people understand it? Can they articulate it? So we can't just have this, values or stuff on a website or whatnot, but can they leave these experiences or see these images, but yet you hear them talking about it in the hallway, right? So it's showing that I get the business value, I get why we're doing it, and I can tell my teams about it. So I would say the ability to articulate it and understand it would be a key measure, and then how they may, say if you're doing it before education, roll out, in this case, how attendance and participation and engagement as a result of it. I don't know if you would add anything else, Jackie, on the measure side in particular.
Yeah, just a comment around measuring cultural competence, right, which was the big topic of our conversation today. Couple of quick thoughts there. I mean, you can measure cultural competence at an organizational level using an instrument called the Intercultural Development Inventory. Some of you might be familiar with that. You can kind of measure the stage that an organization is at on this kind of journey to cultural competence. Also, you can measure it at a team level, right? So we were talking about those middle managers, but an inclusive team assessment, which is something we've done with a lot of organizations. Let's take a look at a team by team by team basis. What's the inclusion level here? Where's our opportunities? And then give that that manager an opportunity, to uniquely address it within their arena. And then, I think there's always the individual behaviors. So those conscious inclusion principles have a whole set of behaviors behind each one that are very measurable. And, we've got we think a great way to go about measuring the behavioral stuff is not so much with, a big lengthy survey that you run every 2 years, but, getting a daily pulse check. How can we just kind of take a temperature check on a daily basis around how we're doing on those conscious inclusion principles? And you might be saying, what, daily? And I would say the answer to that is yes. Yes, daily. And we've got a way to do that, and we can tell you more about that in our follow-up conversation with you.
Yeah. So I think we might be out of time for questions with just 1 minute left, but I strongly encourage you to, let's continue the dialogue. Go to kgdiversity.com, let's talk, and look forward to connecting with each of you.